I would like to now introduce our keynote speaker, our own Louis Johnston in the Economics Department, whose title tonight is The Liberal Arts and the Wealth of Nations.
It's reading the program, and it says addressed to new members, so the rest of you can all go. I don't see anybody getting up, so. Well, thank you for the opportunity to share some ideas with you tonight. That, after all, is what Phi Beta Kappa is all about. So let me repeat and begin by congratulating our new members. My wife, Susan Riley, and I have been members of Phi Beta Kappa for over 30 years. And as we moved from Minnesota, where we were undergraduates, to California to go to graduate school, to Maine for my first job, and back here to Minnesota, we've connected with Phi Beta Kappa chapters in every place we've been. And staying connected with the society, it really continues to enrich our lives. And I urge you all to keep in touch with the society wherever life may take you. And that means all over. So look up where the Phi Beta Kappa chapter is before you go, and say it also, so you pronounce it right. And you will have a great time. So, as you heard earlier, Phi Beta Kappa was founded at the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia on December 5th, 1776. 1776 is, of course, a special year to Americans more generally, because on July 4th, 1776, the Continental Congress declared that the colonies, quote, ought to be free and independent states, are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and fully dissolved, and that as free and independent have full power to war, peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and to do all other acts and things which independent states may have right to do. Wow. Inspiring words. 1776, though, is important for another reason. On March 9th, 1776, a professor of moral philosophy at the University of Glasgow named Adam Smith published a book. Its title was An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. That book, which we usually refer to simply as The Wealth of Nations, is the founding document of my discipline, which is economics. So, what's so special about that time that it would produce the book, The Wealth of Nations, the Declaration of Independence, and Phi Beta Kappa? And how the heck is The Wealth of Nations, both the book and the subject, related to the liberal arts? And further, why should you even care about this? Well, partly because you're sitting here, but I'm going to try and make it worth your while. Like any good economist, you start with a picture. Let's see if this works. Oh, beautiful. They'd take away my economist card if I don't show at least one graph. Have to have a graph. Those of you who've had classes with me have seen this graph probably more than you ever wanted to in your life, but I'm showing it anyway. I call this the hockey stick of incomes. On the vertical axis, you'll see that it measures GDP per capita, or income per person. And there's all kinds of fancy things we do to try to compare things over time. Just trust me for the moment. About constant, inflation-adjusted, anything else you can think of, dollars. On the horizontal axis, we're just measuring time. Now, notice where the blade curves away from the horizontal axis. If I could zoom in, if I was better at computer graphics and stuff, you'd notice it's right around 1750. That's interesting. 1776, 1750, that isn't that far apart. Let's take a little bit more in-depth look at the details here. Start over there at the left-hand side. To the best of our knowledge, average incomes 2,000 years ago were pretty much the same all over the planet. And they stayed that way until about 800 years ago. Then we start to see things change, especially in areas of Europe. Think England, the Netherlands, Spain, parts of Italy, and East Asia. Think China, Japan, Korea. Standards of living started improving in these areas as well. And on top of that, population grew as well, both in quantity and. These patterns intensified between 800 and 500 years ago, especially in Western Europe. Now, not all was going well. Many people know way more about this period of European history than I do. They will be sure to tell you that plagues, infectious diseases, and war regularly wiped out large numbers of people, with the result that population and income would grow for a time and then fall back. Grow for a time and then fall back. But starting in the 16th century, both standards of living and population started growing consistently, year after year, decade after decade, in Western Europe and especially in areas of the modern-day Netherlands and England. And this trend intensified and spread in the 17th and 18th centuries, and then exploded, as you can see, in the 19th and 20th centuries. The Nobel laureate Simon Kuznets labeled this phenomenon modern economic growth. Economists never come up with cool names for anything, right? So modern, okay. So modern economic growth. And this phenomenon of modern economic growth has led to standards of living beyond anything Adam Smith imagined in 1776, and income disparities across the globe that were equally unimaginable. You might ask, how do we know this? Well, archaeological and anthropological evidence on things like caloric intake and shelter over the years. We have written accounts of daily life in various parts of the world. We have evidence on climate and how it would have affected growing seasons and yields. In short, we can tell this story in this simple little graph here because hundreds of scholars, perhaps thousands, have carefully applied all the tools in the liberal arts toolkit to help us understand standards of living across time and space. It's been a group effort across the liberal arts. Now, this leads me to a question that, to be honest, I've been obsessed with for 30 years. How can standards of living be so different in the United States, Brazil, China, and Ethiopia, just to pick 4 of the countries listed there? Think about it. We all live on the same ball of dirt, right? We're all made of the same DNA. And yet, standards of living in the United States are a factor of 8 to 10 times bigger than they are in China, and even more in places in sub-Saharan Africa. How can that be? Well, if you ask an economist that question, he or she will answer by saying, there are three proximate sources of growth. Kind of dull, but let me tell you what they are. One is higher labor force participation. That is, get more people working as a percentage of the population. That'll cause growth. Give those people more resources, more physical capital, tools and things. Better educated, better health. We call that human capital. More natural capital per worker. Make sure every farmer, for example, has more acres of land to till. And then the third one is greater productivity. That is, for a given amount of those resources, for a given number of people working, get more out of each unit. Now, if I were to ask you what's the most important factor, and you answered the way my classes usually do and the way people usually answer when I give talks to chambers of commerce and things like that, they would say, it's got to be more resources per worker. That's got to be the key. After all, it's capitalism, right? Capitalism. Well, I bring this up because this leads to a very particular story about the bend in the hockey stick. It goes like this. Europeans got rich because they had what Jared Diamond called guns, germs, and steel. And that allowed them to exploit the human and material resources of the Americas, Africa, and Asia. And in fact, this both made Europeans wealthier and impoverished the rest of the world. Voila, income differences. And there's a lot of truth to this story. It's clearly true that Europeans committed atrocities, gouged out mineral wealth all over the world, and enslaved entire peoples. However, there's one little problem with it. It turns out that the Europeans who most relied on this recipe for growth were not the ones who both got rich and kept getting richer. Spain, for instance, got rich early on, but was falling behind already the rest of Europe by 1750. So that might have been an initial jump, but that isn't what kept the hockey stick bent. No, the biggest factor of all in understanding why the hockey stick bent and why there are such great disparities in income today across countries is productivity. It's using your resources in new and more efficient ways. And this is where the liberal arts comes back into the picture. The liberal arts both created the bend in the hockey stick and continues to contribute mightily to economic growth today. So how did this happen? Well, I don't have another half hour or anything, so I won't give you all the details. But the short version is that the bend in the hockey stick was a product of the Enlightenment in general, and of the scientific revolution in particular, which grew out of it. Now here I want to highlight an argument that's been made by an economic historian and economist named Joel McCure. He's at Northwestern University. And he argues that the scientific enlightenment that we all hear about of the 16th and 17th century, it not only had to happen, but it had to take root and start to spread in places like England and Holland for a while before it could generate what he calls an industrial enlightenment in the 18th and 19th century. That's a nice way to put it, but let me translate it. What was needed, in other words, I think, was the spread of the liberal arts, especially ideas developed in philosophy, natural science, and a variety of areas today we would call social science. To be even more blunt, Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations when he did because that's when the hockey stick was bending. And that's why Phi Beta Kappa was founded. And that's why the Declaration of Independence happened when it did, because this was a revolutionary time in human affairs. And it was revolutionary, the stick was bending, because the fruits of the spread of the liberal arts were bursting out everywhere that Adam Smith looked and generating huge improvements in the wealth of nations. So what about today? Politicians ask questions like, quote, "Is it a vital interest of the state to have more anthropologists? I don't think so." That's from a governor. Another governor asked, "Why should we subsidize intellectual curiosity?" Good questions. My answer is that intellectual curiosity and the liberal arts drive the wealth of nations. Countries that suppress the arts and humanities, that underfund basic scientific research, or mock the social sciences as simply codified common sense, that's a quote, are the ones that find themselves growing more slowly or even slipping into stagnation. And so this is where you guys come in, you new members and fellow members of Phi Beta Kappa. To quote the great philosopher Stanley Martin Lieber, "With great power comes great responsibility." Did anybody catch that? Stanley Martin Lieber is also known as Stanley. We must be advocates, I would argue, for the liberal arts, for intellectual curiosity, for enlightenment, because they are the mainspring of human betterment. So if someone asks, do we really need more English majors? You should answer, yes. If someone asks, well, isn't it better to study something practical like chemical engineering instead of chemistry, or electrical engineering instead of physics? You should answer, no. We need them both. Just remember the hockey stick. Thank you very much.